welcome to the debate.
Good to be here.
Today, we are dissecting a tension that sits right at the heart of human communication. It is a friction point that anyone who has ever tried to learn a second language, or frankly, anyone trying to articulate a complex thought under pressure, has felt intimately. We are looking at what we call the architect's dilemma.
Yeah, it is that paralyzing moment where you have the idea, you have the desire to connect, but the mechanics just fail you. The central question we are wrestling with today is this: is grammar the essential glue that holds language together, or is it a cage that prevents a speaker from actually speaking?
It is a really fascinating framing because it forces us to choose a priority. On one side, you have the structuralist argument, which is my side of the table. Today, this is the idea that without a rigorous framework, without that architecture, communication just collapses into a pile of rubble.
Right, and on the other side, you have the functionalist perspective, which I will be championing. This is the argument that the absolute priority is the transfer of meaning. If the structure gets in the way of the flow, you simply discard the structure. Because look, if you wait for the blueprints to be perfect, you never actually build the house.
Here are much higher than just passing a French exam or getting a good grade in English composition. We are talking about how human beings connect and whether we can trust the signals we are sending each other. The dilemma really centers on the tension between building a sentence correctly versus delivering it smoothly.
Exactly. And I argue that prioritizing grammar leads to what we call the fluency trap. It is a state of over-monitoring where the speaker is, frankly, so terrified of making a mistake that they become paralyzed. I believe true fluency comes from functional communication, where raw meaning takes absolute precedence over academic perfection.
Well, and I represent the stance that grammar is the structural map essential for true fluency. My position is that without internalized rules, the brain simply cannot build sentences efficiently. If you ignore the architecture, you don't get freedom, you get chaos.
Well, let's get into it then. I want to challenge this idea of the structural map right out of the gate. You talk about it as if it is a helpful guide, but for most learners, it feels like a massive barrier.
But let's look at why it feels like a barrier versus what it actually does. The premise of the structuralist view is that fluency isn't just about speed, right? It is about smooth delivery. You cannot have smoothness if you are constantly reinventing the wheel every time you open your mouth.
I don't disagree that smoothness is pleasant to listen to, but I question the cost of achieving it. If the cost of smoothness is silence because I am too afraid to speak, then the price is way too high.
But consider the cost of not having the map. This is really about cognitive load. When we look at how the brain processes language, without a grasp of basic sentence structures, the brain is forced to build every sentence from scratch, word by word. Think about the mental energy involved there. If I am speaking to you and I have to manually select a subject, then manually select a verb, then consciously conjugate that verb, then place a preposition.
It is exhausting. We have all been there, standing in front of a waiter or a colleague, just sweating because we are trying to assemble the puzzle pieces in real time.
Exactly. It is cognitively expensive. The argument for the structural map is that grammar provides chunks of language. These are prefabricated architectural elements. We are talking about lexical bundles, patterns like I have been, or if I were, or what do you think about?
Right. Phrases that act as single units rather than a collection of words.
Precisely. This is cognitive offloading. If I have the grammar down, if I own that chunk, I can grab it and use it without pausing to think of every individual word. That is not a cage, that is a power tool. It frees up my mental RAM to focus on the message itself rather than the mechanics of delivery.
I see why you latch onto the efficiency argument. On paper, it is irrefutable. If you have the prefab walls, you build the house faster. But let me give you a different perspective on what happens in the messy reality of real-time speech. You talk about these chunks as if they are instantly available to the learner. But for most people, accessing those rules requires a process we call over-monitoring.
Monitoring is simply a quality control mechanism. It is necessary for accuracy.
But there is a tipping point where quality control shuts down the factory entirely. The fluency trap describes a specific paralysis. It is when you are so focused on the rules, on the map, that you forget to drive the car. It describes a speaker who is essentially spell-checking their thoughts before they even leave their mouth.
We all self-correct. That is perfectly natural.
This isn't self-correction, though. It's self-censorship. If I am pausing to ensure I have the correct chunk, as you call it, my speech becomes hesitant. I am no longer connecting with you. I am taking a test in my own head. The brain is so busy verifying the grammar that it loses the entire thread of the conversation.
But look at the alternative. If you don't have the chunks, what are you left with? We see this all the time, staccato speech. If you disregard the grammar, you end up with short, broken phrases. He go, store, buy, bread. You might get the raw meaning across, but you are forcing the listener to do all the heavy lifting to connect those dots.
He go, store, buy, bread. It is not poetry, I grant you that, but did you understand it?
I understood the raw data points. I did not understand the nuance, the timing, or the relationship between those points.
But you understood enough to pass the salt. And that is where we diverge. I am looking at the distinction between functional grammar and academic grammar. The argument is that minor slips, saying he go instead of he goes, do not stop a person from being fluent in a casual interaction. The conversation continues. The connection happens.
Fluent seems to be a very moving target in your definition.
The goal of vocabulary, according to the functionalist view, is expressing raw meaning. If I say he go, you know I mean motion toward a location. You aren't confused. The cage you are building with your insistence on the structural map is what stops the speaker from even attempting that sentence because they are terrified of missing the S at the end of the verb.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it creates a false dichotomy between accuracy and flow. You're suggesting we have to choose one or the other. My position is that the structural map actually creates the flow. We need to dive deeper into this issue of cognitive load because I think that is where the battle is really won or lost.
Let's do that, because I think the load is actually much heavier on your side of the aisle.
I disagree fundamentally. The core function of grammar is predictability. This is crucial for both the speaker and the listener. When we talk about the glue, we are talking about automation. If I have automated the rule that yesterday requires a past tense verb, I don't have to think about it.
Once you automate, that is a very heavy lift doing a lot of work in that sentence. You are skipping over the years of struggle required to reach that automation.
But it is the necessary work. If I have automated the structure, my brain is free to focus on the message. The predictability allows the listener to understand quickly. If I am constantly breaking the rules, your brain, as the listener, has to work overtime to decode my broken signals.
I come at it from the psychological angle. The fluency trap is rooted in fear. For a learner, or really anyone trying to speak clearly under pressure, the effort to automate feels like a barrier, not a shortcut. It is a trap because the speaker believes they must be perfect before they can be effective.
We aren't demanding perfection, though. We are demanding structure. There is a difference.
But where does the learner draw the line? If I am constantly checking my internal map, my speech becomes slow and hesitant. That hesitation destroys the connection. If I am talking to you and I pause for 5 seconds to find the perfect conjugation of to be, I have lost you. I have lost the rhythm of the interaction.
And I would argue that if you lose the structure, you lose the authority.
The cage isn't the lack of structure. The cage is the pursuit of perfection. It is the voice in your head saying, don't speak unless it is correct.
And I would argue the cage is the chaos of unstructured thought. If you don't have the map, you are lost in the woods. You might be running fast, but you aren't going anywhere. You are just making noise.
I would rather run fast and stumble occasionally than stand perfectly still looking at a map. At least I am moving.
That is a compelling soundbite, sure. But let's look at the listener's experience. This is what we call the listener's burden. We often forget that conversation is a two-way street. Grammar ensures the listener doesn't get confused about when something happened, tense, or who did it, subject.
I acknowledge that ambiguity is a problem. I am not arguing for complete gibberish.
It is more than a problem, it is a failure of communication.
Linguistics tells us that the human brain is a prediction machine. When I listen to you, I am subconsciously predicting the next word based on grammatical patterns. If you say, I went to the, my brain is already priming for a noun. If you say, I went to the quickly, my brain stumbles, it glitches.
Sure, predictive processing.
Exactly. If you ignore these rules of the road and you mix up your tenses, I don't know if you did the project, are doing the project, or will do the project, that isn't a minor slip like he go. That is a fundamental breakdown. The listener has to stop listening to your ideas and start debugging your code.
That is fair. Regarding time and subject, those are high-stakes errors. But let's look closer at that rules of the road analogy, because I think it actually supports my point.
How so?
The analogy says you need to know which side of the road to drive on. That is the functional safety, the when and who. If you drive on the wrong side, you die. I agree. But, and this is key, you do not need to know the chemical composition of the asphalt to drive the car.
I agree. You don't need to be a linguist to speak. You don't need to know the Latin root of the word. But you do need to follow the traffic laws.
The traffic laws of survival, yes. But the chemical composition represents that academic perfection, the nuance of the subjunctive mood or the absolute perfect preposition choice. The functionalist argues that as long as you stay on the right side of the road, you are driving, you are communicating.
Which is what happens when you discard grammar as a cage. You crash. You keep minimizing the impact of errors, calling them chemical composition. But often, what you call a nuance is actually a vital directional sign.
I think you are overestimating the fragility of the listener. We are actually quite good at context clues. If I say, yesterday I buy bread, the word yesterday overrides the present tense of buy. You know it happened in the past.
But I had to work for it.
A microsecond of work. The distinction I want to make is speaking fluently versus speaking perfectly. In a casual conversation, small errors rarely stop you from being fluent. As long as the context is understood, the nuances can be imperfect. The core thesis I am defending is exactly this. Effective communication is greater than perfect conjugation.
Effective communication is greater than perfect conjugation. It is a very catchy formula. But we need to define effective. This brings us to our third point, defining fluency itself. Is it smoothness or is it correctness? Because I would argue that if you were forcing me to do mental gymnastics to understand your yesterday buy bread logic, you are not being effective. You are being burdensome.
Fluency is connection. It is the transfer of an idea from my brain to yours. Vocabularies for expressing raw meaning. If I have the vocabulary, people understand what I mean. That is the baseline of effectiveness.
But grammar is defined as organizing meaning. Without organization, meaning is just a cloud. The result of grammar is that people understand the context and nuances instantly. Without context and nuance, are we really having a conversation, or are we just barking keywords at each other?
Keyword barking is a bit extreme, but let's talk about staccato again, because you brought it up as the enemy earlier.
Yes, staccato speech, that broken, halting delivery, is the direct opposite of fluency. Even if you know the words, if you deliver them in a choppy rhythm because you lack the structural glue, you sound unsure. You sound less authoritative.
Staccato is bad, I agree, but hesitant is worse. The fluency trap creates silence. I would rather hear, me store go now, than 30 seconds of dead air while you mentally conjugate the verb to go.
That is a false choice. You are presenting it as bad grammar versus silence. That is a total straw man.
It is not a straw man for the learner. It is their everyday reality.
But the goal of practice is automating the grammar. You aren't supposed to choose between staccato and silence. You are supposed to use the chunks to bridge the thoughts. If the delivery is broken because the speaker lacks the chunks, they are not fluent. They are struggling.
But the struggle comes from the mental energy being placed in the wrong bucket. If the focus is on the mechanism, the grammar, the flow stops. If the focus is on the result, connection, the brain finds a way.
I am just not convinced. The brain finding a way usually means the brain resorts to pidgin or simplified speech that degrades the quality of the thought. If you want to express a complex idea, like the architect's dilemma itself, you need complex architecture. You cannot build a skyscraper with mud. You need steel. Grammar is the steel.
And I would say that if you spend all your time analyzing the quality of the steel, you never break ground. You never build anything. You just have a pile of perfect beams sitting on an empty lot. You become a theoretician of language rather than a speaker of it.
So how do we move from theory to building? Let's look at the how to balance them concept from the material. We have 3 components: vocabulary, grammar, and practice.
Right, the holy trinity of language learning.
Practice is explicitly for automating the grammar. It implies that the end goal is indeed to have the grammar fully integrated. It doesn't say practice ignoring the grammar. It says practice until the grammar disappears into the automation.
No, but it positions grammar's role as secondary to meaning. The meaning comes first. The organization is secondary. You seem to believe the organization is the meaning.
I believe the organization preserves the meaning. Without the map, the meaning gets lost in transit. Grammar provides the predictability listeners need to understand you quickly. Speed of comprehension is part of fluency. If I have to pause to figure out what you meant, you aren't fluent.
And if you never speak because you are afraid of the rules, you are definitely not fluent. We are circling the same drain here. We both want the exact same thing: effortless speech.
True.
But the path there is different. The structuralist wants to learn the map before the journey. The functionalist wants to learn the map during the journey.
That is a very fair distinction.
We have to acknowledge that grammar is essential, but perhaps not in the way you were taught in school. That is the crux for me. School taught us the cage. It taught us that a red pen mark means failure. Real life requires the glue, but maybe a flexible glue, rubber cement, not super glue.
That is an interesting point, though. I would definitely frame it differently. The way you were taught in school usually refers to rote memorization of rules without application, conjugation tables, isolated tests. The structural map I am advocating for is about functional patterns, those chunks again. I have been, if I were. These aren't abstract rules. They are practical tools for speed.
They are tools if you own them. They are burdens if you are just renting them. My view is that you claim ownership through usage, even messy usage, not through study alone.
I can agree that usage is key. Practice leads to true fluency. But notice that true fluency is the result of automating the grammar, not bypassing it. The grammar has to be there.
But the path to automation is paved with mistakes. That is what the fluency trap warns against, the fear of the mistake. If you treat grammar as a cage where every error is punished, you never reach automation, because you never practice freely. You have to be willing to drive on the wrong side of the road occasionally, or at least graze the curb, to learn the route.
I would strongly advise against driving on the wrong side of the road as a learning strategy, both metaphorically and literally. But I do take your point about the fear of error. You cannot let the fear of the cage prevent you from building the map.
Exactly.
So where does that leave us? We have the map and the trap.
I think it leaves us with a question of focus.
Let's bring this to a close then, because I think we've illuminated the tension here perfectly.
To summarize my position, I stand firm with the functionalist view. While grammar absolutely has a place, it must not become an obstacle. The priority must always be effective communication over perfect conjugation.
And
I want to remind the listener that they don't need to be 100% correct to be considered fluent. The fluency trap is very real. When you start spell-checking your own thoughts in real time, you kill the very thing you were trying to create. Connection is messy. Let it be messy. Don't let the architect stop the builder.
I see the appeal of that freedom, but I must stand by the structuralist view. While perfection isn't the ultimate goal, structure is the vehicle for that freedom. I am reversing the initial metaphor. Grammar isn't a cage, it is the structural map that allows for speed.
Well, a map is only useful if you know how to read it.
Precisely. And without the chunks provided by grammar, speech remains disjointed. It's staccato. It becomes exhausting for the listener. You simply cannot have smooth delivery without the architectural support to hold the sentence up.
It seems we both agree on the hierarchy, however. Vocabulary handles the meaning.
Grammar handles the context.
And practice handles the automation. We agree on the ingredients, we disagree on the recipe.
Or at least, we disagree on where the learner should place their mental energy during the act of speaking. I say focus on the person you are talking to.
And I say focus on the clarity of the signal you are sending them.
Both valid, both vital.
Indeed. It suggests that there is a lot more to explore in how we build these maps, or cages, in our own minds.
Thank you for listening to the debate. We hope this helps you navigate your own architectural dilemmas.
Until next time.